California state prisons house nearly 130,000 inmates, and each year, tens of thousands of offenders are released back into the community after serving their sentences. While in prison, offenders often participate in various rehabilitation programs to improve the chances they'll lead a productive, crime-free life upon release. The thought is that, by addressing the underlying factors that led to the criminal activity, it's less likely that they'll reoffend. But do these programs actually work? We'll ask the author of a report, Jonathan Peterson, from the nonpartisan California Legislative Analyst's Office. Reducing Recidivism. Do prisoner rehabilitation programs actually work?
Additional funding for the Maddy report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world. Chevron's Coalinga oil field and Fresno County have been doing side by side for over 100 years. Learn more at doers.com. From the California Channel at the State Capitol and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. The primary goal of prison rehabilitation programs is to reduce the level of recidivism. The question is, do they work? Our guest is Jonathan Peterson with the nonpartisan Legislative Analyst's Office, who recently authored a report that attempts to answer that question. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you for having me, Mark.
So first, let's define recidivism. I know there's different kinds of definitions. How do you measure recidivism?
You're right, Mark. There are different ways someone can measure recidivism. What recidivism tries to measure is how many offenders, after they're released from jail or prison, end up committing additional crimes. For example, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation measures recidivism as the number of offenders who, within 3 years of their release, are convicted of another crime.
Why 3 years? Just they pick 3 years?
Well, a lot of the recidivism that occurs will happen within that first year,
okay.
But it seems like looking over time, that's the amount of time it takes before most inmates, if they're going to recidivate, do end up
Yeah, they're trying to
recidivating.
capture, that period of time. It seems like it would be
Exactly.
enough time. So the goal of rehabilitation programs is to reduce recidivism, all right? And according to your report, researchers have identified 8 significant, what's called criminal risk behaviors, things that are likely to result in reoffending. What are they, and can you give us an example of each and how they're addressed?
Sure. So some of these 8 factors include antisocial behavior, so whether someone associates himself with other people. Antisocial personality would be another one.
So that'd be someone who's aggressive and that kind of thing?
Yeah, and when they're put in situations where they could end up getting into criminal activity, they're not able to manage the situation and avoid that problem.
Okay.
You would also find relationships with other people involved in criminal activity being one of these factors. There could also be attitudes and beliefs that someone has where they're thinking about criminal activity. Having poor relationships with family members would also be one.
Right.
Low involvement with school or work is another one of the factors. There could also be someone who doesn't have a lot of non-criminal activity, hobbies, and also substance use problems.
It's what is it, idle hands or devil's workshop?
Yeah.
And the importance of family, the importance of work, these things that are stable in society prove out true in research. So let's talk about some of the different kinds of rehabilitation programs to kind of address some of these issues.
So there's really 7 major categories of state-funded rehabilitation programs.
Okay.
Some of the larger ones include academic education programs, which could be a GED program or, say, college education program. There's also career technical education or job skills programs. You can imagine a welding certificate program being an example.
And there's a big demand for those kinds of career technical education folks when they get released, I would assume.
Correct. Yeah, we talked about one of the criminal risk factors being employment and whether someone has a sustained work involvement. And so certainly if they have one of these programs and a certificate that will increase the likelihood that they could get a job upon release, could help them out quite a bit.
Great.
You'd also find substance use disorder treatment programs and cognitive behavioral therapy, which you can think of as programs like anger management to try and address some of those behavioral issues and learn how to improve behavior.
Right, when you're upset, don't punch someone in the nose.
Yeah.
Calm down and work your way through it.
Yeah, and there are also some arts programs and volunteer programs, so that kind of rounds out the picture.
Okay. So, you say in your report that successful rehabilitation programs not only reduce crime, but they have other budgetary implications. What are some of those direct and indirect fiscal benefits of rehabilitation programs?
So some of the direct benefits, the fiscal benefits that we can observe that in terms of state and local governments' budgets include reduced incarceration costs. So if someone doesn't come back, the state or local governments don't have to pay to continue to incarcerate.
And again, I can't remember the number, but I would say it's north of $50,000 a year to incarcerate someone.
Yeah, the average cost in a California state prison, so this isn't the county jails,
Right.
is about $75,000.
Yeah, so it's okay. It's well north of $50,000.
Yeah. Now I would note that if we didn't incarcerate that person, the state wouldn't get a $75,000 check because they have to keep the lights on in the prisons. The staff would still be there, but it is a lot more expensive. To house someone in a facility rather than just provide them with a rehabilitation.
It's kind of being
program.
proactive versus reactive. We can lock them up, or we can try to make sure they don't take that path or don't return to that path after they're released. So you're talking about the direct implications.
Yeah.
What are some of the indirect fiscal benefits?
So you can think of, I think a great example is someone who participated in an employment program. If they're able to get a job and keep that job, not only are they not getting involved in criminal activity, not creating crime victims, but they're also potentially not using as much in terms of other government assistance programs. So you might see reduced costs for some of those benefit programs being an indirect benefit of rehabilitation programs.
So they're giving back to society. You know, also in your report, we've only about 30 seconds left in this segment. I want to talk about some of the other benefits you identified in the report. You want to talk about some of those? Managing inmate population, for example?
If for prison rehabilitation programs, you could imagine that having an easier to manage prison population could also benefit the state in terms of its costs.
Because it's more costly to put them in these high-risk situations.
Correct. And also giving inmates opportunities to just increase their educational attainment could also be beneficial, not necessarily from a fiscal standpoint, but all just in terms of increasing the overall well-being of the inmate population.
Yeah. Okay, well, up next, we're going to take a closer look at how inmate needs are assessed and addressed. That conversation in a moment. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Jonathan Peterson, an expert in the prison system with the Nonpartisan Legislative Analyst's Office, on whether prison rehabilitation programs are successful in keeping ex-inmates from committing future crimes after they're released. So it's my understanding that when someone is incarcerated, their rehabilitation needs are assessed. Can you explain that process?
Sure. Whenever someone enters the prison system, they first go to a reception center.
I like that, a reception center.
Yeah, and
I'm not sure the inmates view it that way, but...
Yes, and at these reception centers, they get their various needs assessed. So if they have particular medical needs, healthcare needs, and rehabilitation needs. So they get two assessments. The first is called the CSRA, and it's to identify their risk of recidivating. So each inmate, based on various factors, including their criminal background, gets categorized as low risk, moderate risk, or high risk.
Okay.
Inmates who are higher risk, meaning moderate or high, get priority for rehabilitation programs.
And I was looking at your numbers. I think the total of high risk and moderate risk inmates is, what's the percentage on that? That's the majority, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, it's a little bit, it's around half, so just right about half.
Okay. And then the second thing they do, they have something called COMPASS, the Correctional Offender Management Profiling for Alternative Sanctions.
Exactly.
What a
it's
mouthful.
Quite a mouthful.
COMPASS.
So what this really does, you can think of it as having someone actually sit down with the inmate and interview them and talk about, okay, what is your background? How did you get involved in the activities you've been involved in? And what kind of programs do you have a need for? Which of those risk factors we discussed earlier are you demonstrating?
Yeah, I was recently at a state prison, actually, giving a talk, and I was talking to some of the fellows there. Really a great group of guys when you sit down and talk to them, but some of their backgrounds, I mean, they're really starting off on the wrong foot in life. They just, their parents were alcoholics, had substance abuse problems, or they were beaten by their parents. And they got in the gang life and went off in the wrong direction, and they're trying to change now. And some of these rehabilitation programs are pretty important. Yeah. So what are some of the most common needs that are identified in these programs?
There are 5 that I think stand out more than any others, and they include substance use problems, anger management issues, need for programs that change their criminal thinking, their behavior patterns, employment services programs, which could be one of these job training, career technical education programs, and also programs that target having supportive family relationships.
Yeah, all very important. So you've got a state correctional system. They don't randomly lock up inmates and throw away the key. They're actually assigning inmates to appropriate rehabilitation programs. So how do they then decide, okay, there's a need, and I'm going to assign you to a program? How does that work?
Once the individual is transferred from the reception center to the prison where they're going to be housed, they sit down with a correctional counselor, and they talk through, here are the results of these assessments. What kind of programs are you most interested in being a part of? Then that conversation transfers over to this committee with that counselor and other rehabilitation program staff, and they determine which programs to assign that inmate to.
But even the precursor to that is when they come into the reception center, they're actually sent to institutions that deal with their particular needs. correct?
Yeah,
So
depending on the environment and both from a physical health standpoint, rehabilitation program standpoint, what security level they need to be housed at.
Right. So there's a lot more thought going into it than simply you're going there.
Absolutely.
Okay. So only about 3% of the state prison budget is spent on rehabilitation programs. Sounds like a small figure. It's actually $315 million. Academic and career technical education receive about 2/3 of that amount, so about $200 million. Are there enough rehab programs to address the needs of the prison population?
So the way the department's budget is, they get a certain amount of funding to provide rehabilitation program slots. Right now, they can operate about 114,000 slots annually across the different programs we talked about. And these slots are basically how many inmates can we have in programs and complete them or participate for that year. Now, it's not the same to think of these 114,000 slots as the number of inmates that can be served, because sometimes programs, while they might be full or they might have wait lists, not all inmates are actually attending programs, and there might be some spots available that the institution hasn't been able to place an inmate in yet. So while there are those slots and they provide a certain amount of programming to offenders, it's really difficult to assess whether the number of spaces is how many the state needs. We really don't have the performance measures in place to give us that level of detail.
Well, let me ask you this. You noted earlier in your report that the most frequently identified rehabilitation needs are for substance abuse, anger management, and critical thinking. But when you look at the report, it shows that those programs receive about less than a quarter of all rehabilitation spending. So why the disconnect?
Yeah, part of the reason for that difference in particular between the substance use disorder treatment programs, the cognitive behavioral therapy, and some of the other programs is that those programs are operated through contracts with various rehabilitation program providers, as opposed to the academic education and career technical education, which are operated with state civil service staff. So because the state isn't paying for the complete cost of those employees, they tend to be lower per inmate participant than those academic education programs.
Okay, that's a good explanation. Well, next we're going to look at the current state of rehabilitation programs and where they might fall a little short. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Jonathan Peterson, an expert on the prison system with the Nonpartisan Legislative Analyst's Office, about whether prison rehabilitation programs help keep ex-inmates from reoffending after release. So there are some key principles that determine really whether rehabilitation programs work, reduce recidivism. One of those is whether or not they're evidence-based. What exactly do you mean by that?
Yeah, an evidence-based program has two components. First, it's research-based, meaning elsewhere a rigorous evaluation has been done showing the program can reduce recidivism. The second component is that it's implemented with fidelity. And what that means is that the program not only is based on some sort of research, but it's actually operating as that research-based program laid the program out.
Right, so you can't have a program that says, oh, we're going to copy this program, kinda, in title, but not really follow the A, B, C, and D of the program, because then you're just not comparing apples to apples.
Correct, yeah.
Okay, titles are not determinative. It's the substance of the programs that have to be the same. And you, I think, had in your report a chart on the Washington State savings from various rehabilitation programs, and would that translate directly to California? It would be a little different, wouldn't it?
Not perfect, yeah. So for example, they looked at their career technical education programs and said, per participant, it generates about $4,300 in net savings. Given that California operates similar programs, it stands to reason that our programs may also generate some net benefits. But the cost of operating programs may be different.
The prison population may be different.
Population as well.
Yeah, so there's some other variables that you can't just automatically assume it's going to be directly applicable. Okay. A second key element in successful rehabilitation programs, according to your report, is that they're evaluated for cost effectiveness. Can you explain?
Yeah, if the programs are evidence-based, it increases the likelihood that they reduce recidivism, but it's still important to actually go in and evaluate whether your programs, as they're being operated, in fact do reduce recidivism. As we talked about, a program that was found effective in another state may not prove to be as effective as the program that is operating in California, because the inmate population is different, the cost of providing it may also be different.
Right, so you can't just make an assumption it's going to automatically translate from, say, state of Washington to state of California.
And it's important to look at whether those whether the benefits you get actually justify the costs of continuing to operate that program over time.
You would think that that's an automatic, right? You think that you're going to do a cost-benefit analysis. You wouldn't just automatically assume, but apparently some people do. So finally, effective programs, you say, focus on what's called highest risk and highest need inmates. Can you explain that situation?
Yeah, the research shows that programs that target the higher risk inmates in terms of their risk of recidivating, who also have the greatest level of rehabilitative needs, if you target those inmates, you can generate the greatest reduction in recidivism. And for example, Ohio looked at their rehabilitation programs and found that they were able to reduce recidivism for higher risk inmates by 8% if they participated in a program for over a year. The lower risk inmates, if they participated in that same program for over a year, they ended up having a 7 percentage point higher recidivism.
I saw that in your report, and I'm like, scratching my head thinking, how in the world does that happen? Lower risk actually do worse when they went through that program.
Yeah, and so I think what the main takeaway there is that by providing the correct programs to inmates based on their need could allow the greatest number of inmates to avoid future criminal activity, reduce the number of crime victims that are created, and generate the greatest impact that these programs have, given you have limited funding available.
Right, so you got to focus on the right people and then provide them the right programs, but it has to be focused, kind of pinpointed. You know, in your report, you said that the state-funded programs have a few shortcomings in this regard. What did you find?
Yeah, so first we found that the rehabilitation programs don't always follow the key principles that we just talked about. They aren't always evidence-based. There hasn't been a lot of cost-effectiveness evaluation of CDCR's rehabilitation programs, and that they're not always targeting these higher risk and higher need offenders.
So let me go through some of those. And one of the things you talk about is they're not evidence-based, and one thing you point out is the California Arts and Corrections Program. What's going on there?
So it's a program that provides, brings in instructors from outside of the prisons and has them provide arts instruction, which from a recidivism reduction standpoint, there hasn't been an evaluation that we've seen that details how that program actually reduces recidivism. Doesn't mean it's not a program worth doing, but from just a recidivism reduction priority, that connection hasn't been made to this point.
Just don't know. Another way we're talking when you talk about limited evaluation of cost effectiveness, you're looking at the CTE courses, career technical education courses, and whether they help. I mean, what did you find there?
So back in 2010, the CDCR worked with Chico State University to do an evaluation of their programs and did find that CTE programs resulted in a reduction in recidivism. The key difference, though, is they weren't able to then consider how much they cost to operate those programs. So we know they were effective, we just don't know whether they were cost effective.
Okay, and the last thing you were talking about was they aren't targeted to high risk, high need. What was happening there in California?
I think there are just some programs where they allow inmates of all risk levels, low risk, moderate risk, and high risk, into programs, and that they haven't been targeted to make sure that high risk inmates are in those programs first.
Which are the ones where it actually works and is most effective. Okay, so up next we're going to talk about some of the recommendations the LAO has to help reduce recidivism. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Jonathan Peterson, an expert in the prison system with the nonpartisan LAO, Legislative Analyst's Office, about some of the California prison rehabilitation programs and whether or not they work in terms of reducing recidivism. Now, you've come up with some recommendations. The first one you said was the prison system should be required to show that these programs are evidence-based. How do they go about doing that?
Yeah, so as we discussed previously, being evidence-based requires that programs are research-based and implemented with fidelity. And so our recommendation is twofold. First, we recommend that the legislature direct CDCR to present a report showing the research that each of its programs is based off of. And when the legislature determines which programs to provide ongoing funding for, that they only provide funding for research-based programs.
The one thing I noticed in your report, you also said eliminate funding for those where they can't show. You're going to give them some time to show you that, but if they can't show you empirically these things are working, then no.
Yeah, and we do in our report address corrective action plans to give them that time that you mentioned.
Yeah.
And then second, we do recommend that these programs are regularly evaluated to ensure that they are implemented with fidelity, to make sure that they not only are operating effectively, but continue to do so on an ongoing basis. And we think that the combination of these recommendations will allow CDCR to maximize the potential reduction in recidivism.
Right, which makes sense. So the second thing you argue is, quote, it's critical to measure the actual effect programs have on recidivism. I mean, unquote. In other words, you want to measure the actual cost effectiveness of rehab programs. How do you suggest the state go about doing that?
Yeah, so it's right now, given the lack of cost effectiveness evaluations, it's really difficult, if not impossible, for the legislature to assess whether it's making the most use out of its limited rehabilitation program resources. So what we're recommending to the legislature is that they work with independent researchers to decide how to do this in the most effective way, to go out and look at how cost effective are rehabilitation programs as CDCR is currently operating.
What I thought interesting in your report was you were taking a look at a longitudinal study, that appeared over time, which, as a college professor, I feel the same way about, are we doing an effective job teaching our students? Don't ask them how well they like the class, but follow them 3, 5, 10 years out. Are they successful in their careers? And you're kind of thinking the same way with these programs.
You're exactly right. Yeah, it'd be important to look at least a few years out to see whether or not it took a while for the recidivism reductions to happen or whether they were immediate.
Yeah. So the third thing you say you want the state to do is you want them to more effectively target programs to high-risk and high-need inmates. How do they go about doing that?
Yeah, as we talked about, targeting those inmates can help maximize the potential recidivism reduction. And first, we recommend a committee comprised of rehabilitation program staff, researchers, and stakeholders in these programs to make sure CDCR is using the right tools to identify which are the inmates that are the highest risk to recidivate. Second, we recommend that the legislature directs CDCR to prioritize the enrollment of its highest risk and highest need offenders to make sure that those inmates, the greatest number of those inmates possible, are released having all of their rehabilitative needs met to help reduce the level of recidivism.
So the last thing you want to see is high risk, high need folks getting released from prison. You know they have this need, but they don't get the training or whatever they need, the help they need, and they're right back engaging in crime again. So let me talk about the fourth thing you said. There are several recommendations. The fourth one you had is you want to see some improvement in the efficient use of existing rehabilitation resources. What exactly are you recommending there?
Yeah, so to ensure that the legislature and CDCR have the information necessary to determine whether it's making the most use out of its existing funding, we first recommend that the legislature have CDCR conduct an assessment of its existing programs to determine what resources would be needed to meet all of the needs of its offenders, and particularly those highest risk and highest need offenders, to determine where we are compared to that amount of funding. And additionally, we recommend that the legislature consider whether or not to incorporate attendance into how it funds rehabilitation programs.
I saw that recommendation. That was really interesting. It's very much like schools, right? Schools are given money based on average daily attendance, and you're thinking the same thing in prison training programs.
Right, and it might be attendance. It might also include other performance measures. The goal is to give CDCR an incentive to make sure that inmates get to these programs as frequently as they're offered, to make sure that if they're happening, that inmates are able to take advantage of it.
It's just really interesting because I have a child in school, and yes, there's implicit pressure to show up at school, to not cut classes because they're counting on that average daily attendance to get their funding.
That's right.
Finally, you recommend improved performance measures to enable regular oversight. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so robust performance metrics are really needed to enable regular oversight over these rehabilitation programs. How effectively is the funding being used? To what extent is legislative or department action needed to improve them? And at a minimum, CDCR should provide reliable information on things like the percentage of inmates in a given year who are enrolled in programs consistent with their needs, and the percentage of inmates that are released having their needs met.
Now that's a bunch of very good recommendations that the legislature and CDCR will probably be looking at, we hope. I want to thank our guest, Jonathan Peterson from the California's Legislative Analyst's Office, for joining us. If you want to stay up with state and local politics, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter, or log on to the Maddy Institute website to follow us on the Maddy Daily. This is Mark Keppler from the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.